Welcome to Deloitte's Debriefs Tax webcast in Asia Pacific. Our webcast today is from our Global Mobility Talent and Rewards series and is entitled The Return of Travel, Are You Ready? My name is Jod Gill and I'm a Tax and Immigration Director based in Deloitte, Singapore, and I have the pleasure of hosting today's webcast. I have three highly regarded speakers with me today: Carl Jones, Sandip Bandal, and Jimish Vicaria. Carl is the head of strategy for SAP Concur across Asia Pacific and is based in Singapore. Sandip is an immigration director based in Deloitte, Singapore. And Jimish is a global mobility subject matter expert based in Deloitte, India. You may access our bios on the left side of the screen. Before I introduce the agenda for today's webcast, I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the features of our webcast console. First of all users are on listen-only mode. If you have any content-related questions at all, please do submit these at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand of your screen. We have allocated plenty of time at the end to respond to any questions that you raise during the presentation. Second, all PC users can maximize or minimize each box at your convenience during the webcast. You may also explore the icons at the bottom of the screen if you want, and you can use that to download today's slides and related publications. To do that, please go to the Downloads and Links box. In addition, mobile users can view the slides and answer the survey on screen. Finally, if you require an attendance record for this event, you can download your CPE certificate by clicking the Request CPE icon at the bottom of the webcast console. So, moving to our agenda for today. As they say, timing is everything in life, and we've been very fortunate to start to see some easement of border restrictions in Singapore and other APAC locations over recent weeks. This session will focus on the potential impact of the significant increase in personal travel that we're likely to see over the holiday period, starting shortly with Diwali, going through to Thanksgiving. We will then have Christmas, New Year, and then clearly also the Lunar New Year in early 2022. So our discussion today will focus on the outlook for travel going forward, the immigration and tax considerations for employers, the implications for business travel, and then some time allotted at the end for your questions. So let's get the discussion on the road. If we can move through to the next slide, thank you. So Carl, firstly, welcome and thank you for joining us today. I know that in your role, you've been working very closely with the travel sector since the beginning of the pandemic. And now that we're beginning to see some easement of borders here in APAC, can you share your thoughts on what the outlook for personal travel is likely to be going forward?
Certainly, Jod. And firstly, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to yourself and those listening today. In terms of what we expect from the travel industry as we look forward over the next year or so, it's very clear that recovery will be uneven. So we're going to see across the different regions of the world a very different response to how we go back to travel. And a lot of that is driven by domestic national immigration policies. So we're seeing recovery in the United States at near pre-pandemic levels in many cases. That's domestically. And as the United States is beginning to open up again, we'll expect to see that either transatlantic flight increases or just general international travel as well. But what's critical is not just the origin, but also the destination of a flight. And that's where some of the challenges are, particularly here in the Asia Pacific region, where the predominant number of flights are obviously international. I'll come on to China and Australia and India in a moment. But if we look at the international flights, certainly international travel has been curtailed in well over 90%. In corporate travel, over 99% of corporate travel internationally has been curtailed. So real challenges there. I think as well some of the complexity of the rules. So it's not just as simple as actually entering a country, but some of the rules differ, of course, as well. So here in Singapore, we have the vaccinated travel lanes, which only apply to certain flights in certain countries for certain individuals. If you are a citizen or a permanent resident, the rules are different in terms of applying to come back into the country than if you're an employment pass holder. So really, even just in a simple, what is meant to be a simple case, we see these complexities really coming through. The airline industry has been really challenged, obviously, and it's been pretty unprecedented. Really not since World War II have we ever seen such an impact in international travel. A recent IATA report, and there are links to the report on this presentation, a recent IATA report a couple of weeks ago, which I think is one of the best global analysis of what we may expect going forward, really highlighted the fact that airlines have been bailed out to almost $250 billion so far. And that's obviously expected to continue. That's been by a variety of things like wage subsidies, direct loans, or direct cash investment from governments to keep their airlines and national carriers afloat. Or afly, I guess is the correct word. But really making sure that the industry itself can try and recover. Cargo has filled some of the gap. And we expect to see that going forward next year. But really, there's nothing better than passengers on a plane to try and increase the revenues. The airlines are projected, again, 2022 for a continued loss. A lot of the headwinds in terms of fuel costs rising will go against them. So even though we expect passenger numbers to increase, really that headwind of increased costs and still really lack of inventory being filled is going to be a challenge for the industry. So net, the sooner countries can try and relax and try and remove some of their border restrictions, the quicker we're going to see travel across the board generally, both for leisure as well as corporate. And corporate travel, I think the generally accepted premise is that corporate travel will be latter to follow because of the cautiousness that some organizations have to put their employees in harm's way, as it were.
Thanks, Carl. A lot to ponder there, I think, and definitely some threads that will continue to pull away at during the rest of this discussion. So that sets us up nicely, I think, for our first polling question of the day. And this question is, what are the major immigration challenges you are currently facing when relocating employees across borders? And your options are, our travel policy still prohibits travel, borders are still closed, there is increased complexity that is too difficult to navigate, employers are still not comfortable to travel, and other. So whilst you're responding to that question, maybe if I can bring in Sandip. Sandip, what are the most common issues or concerns that your immigration clients are currently highlighting to you at the moment?
Thanks, Jod. I think if we go back a step pre-COVID, immigration, relocation, it was never easy. And I think the pandemic has definitely made it more challenging. And what we're seeing is governments introducing unprecedented measures, obviously around the testing and quarantine requirements, but also exit requirements. That's not something we've seen before. So countries like Malaysia and Australia have required their residents and citizens to apply for exemptions as to why they need to travel. And I think that just brings in even more complexity. So when we're looking at people traveling from one location to another, it's not just a simple case of grabbing your passport and being able to jump on a flight and travel. It's having to navigate all those additional challenges of, do I have permission to leave? Do I have permission to land in the country that I'm going to? And obviously this creates more for employers to be able to navigate around.
Absolutely. So hopefully we've got our results available. Some really interesting spread of responses there. Clearly, a large part of this aligns to what Carl was talking about in terms of borders still being closed. and the increased complexity is clearly, proving troublesome. But what are your thoughts there, San, in terms of the travel policy still prohibiting travel and employees not being comfortable to travel? Is that chiming with your experience?
It is, absolutely. I think drawing on some of the points that Carl raised around each country has its own requirements, very specific requirements. So some borders are still closed. They're closed to visitors. They're closed to all travellers. Again, it's not an easy process to navigate anymore. The complexity is definitely quite difficult. And I think the results are very telling about the current immigration landscape that we're in.
So on the immigration landscape, what challenges are we seeing there across the region?
Yeah, we can move on to the next slide. So in terms of challenges that we're currently seeing, immigration has been hugely impacted by the pandemic, and some of the border closures that we saw really early on last year, sort of January, February last year of 2020, we're only starting to see the restrictions being eased now. And with that, we're in October now, so usually at this time of the year, as you said, Jod, we would usually be gearing up towards significant amounts of travel as we lead into Thanksgiving, into Christmas, into the Lunar New Year next year. So usually people would have been traveling, they would have been going to home countries, they would have been going on holiday. And what we're seeing now is that there still is that huge appetite to travel, but obviously there's a lot more risk involved now. Last year, not everywhere was closed, so we still had Europe open. America still saw a huge inflow of travel, whereas this region we were much more conservative. The governments were very cautious and really kept those borders closed. So we are expecting to see more people wanting to travel this year. And that obviously brings about considerations and risks that employers need to be aware of. So there are so many factors that come into play for travel in general, but especially at this time of year. So going into some of the points that maybe need to be considered, such as the winter flu, for example, which is common in the Northern Hemisphere at this time of year. And what also should be taken into consideration is the virus itself and any new variants of it. Obviously, we were impacted by the Delta variant earlier on this year, and this can really impact how quickly things can change. I think we've all lived through the last 2 years, and we know how quickly governments have reacted to any changes in rising numbers of cases, and how quickly border closures have come in, how restrictions have come in for travellers coming from particular countries. So this is still very real. We are still in the pandemic, and this shouldn't be underestimated. In terms of COVID, where we are now, there has been a positive shift, I would say, with vaccination rollouts. Most countries haven't mandated that their residents need to take up the vaccine, but it has still been a successful rollout, and this has impacted travel. So because of the positive vaccination rollouts, we are seeing that some of the travel restrictions are lifting to enable people to travel, or if they have been vaccinated, they may be able to go through a more eased level of travel, so they may not be subject to as much testing requirements, or they may not have to go through the levels of quarantine that other travellers who are not vaccinated. So that's definitely a positive shift. I think we can't relax just yet. There are some countries out there where the vaccination rates are still low, and that's going to impact travellers, especially your employees who are travelling to those locations, and their ability to travel back out of those locations and the requirements that they may be subject to. Even with all the easing of these restrictions, we're not quite at that point yet where people can just freely travel wherever they want to. In this region in particular, in Asia Pacific, many of the countries still have their borders closed to visitors. And even where there is travel permitted, there may be the approvals required. Certainly in Singapore, we have that, where foreigners coming in need to have pre-approval before they can travel to Singapore. And as I mentioned, countries like Australia, Malaysia require exit approval. So it has to be a joined up process. Singapore, we have a categorization of risk levels from countries that individuals are traveling from 1 through to 4. 1 to 3 are relatively easy in terms of obtaining those entry approvals, but 4 we're still seeing difficult to navigate because slots are not always available to travel from those locations. I think a couple of weeks ago, some of us were here in Singapore rejoicing with the enhancement of the vaccinated travel lane as it was expanded. This hasn't opened up completely. As Carl said, it's only available to certain travel lanes, certain depending on your vaccinations, whether you can have proof of that. So it's still subject to a number of conditions and also subject to a quota. So it's a daily quota of 3,000 per day. So it's not we're not able to travel freely as we were pre-pandemic. This can be difficult for employers to manage because we've got so many systems in place. We've got the vaccinated travel lane process, we've got pre-entry processes, and this just makes it even more challenging to understand what levels of sponsorship are required, if at all, because the vaccinated travel lane is not employer sponsored. So it's down to the individual to make those applications and manage that process themselves. So then moving on, we can move on to the next slide and look at more broader immigration challenges. This has been a definite challenging time for employers, and not just because of the border restrictions. There's been more underlying factors as well. So employers looking to recruit new talent or move around their current talent have a lot of new issues that they need to think about. And they're not always the obvious ones like the border restrictions. So what we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic is that it has impacted jurisdictions from an economic standpoint. So there's definitely been an economic downturn, which has impacted businesses. It's impacted unemployment rates. So one of the first things that governments will look at is, why is there a need for foreign employment when we have rising levels of unemployment within our citizens and residents? So because of that shift, we've definitely seen longer processing times when we're submitting immigration applications. We've seen immigration officers scrutinizing applications much more, coming back to us, asking for justification as to why foreign employees are required, also asking for more documentary evidence to show that proper tests of the labour market have been carried out. So that then has an impact on how long it takes to hire new foreign talent. And also immigration authorities, they're still under strain. During lockdowns, immigration is not considered an essential service. So we find that applications are put on the back burner until they're ready to be processed. And some countries where there are multiple steps involved, like Taiwan and Japan, for example, you may be able to complete the earlier stages, the in-country processes, but you may not be able to move on to any visa applications from the location that the individual is traveling from. So even though part of the application may be done, you're not at that stage where you can actually physically move your employee until they have their visa in place. We've certainly seen disrupted workforces with border closures, and I know we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive on this, the individuals coming from the Indian subcontinent, which has been subject to stringent travel bans for many countries. They have been disrupted and they've not been able to move as they would have normally. And this has impacted companies looking at other options for them, possibly looking at remote work options or extended periods of leave for them. Not really an ideal situation, certainly from an advisor standpoint. when we look at moving individuals from one country to another, it's not a case of just having to look at one option. Often we have to look at multiple options to get them into the right time zone, and then so they can travel to the host location once they're able to, once travel restrictions lift, or once they're able to meet the requirements. Another point to mention is generally we would see big influences of movement around in line with the academic school year. So July to September were popular periods, as was the start of the year. Often that's not the case anymore. Individuals are having to travel as and when they can, looking at from a restriction standpoint. So that definitely has impacted the employee experience to some degree. And then touching on business travel, I know Carl talked about it, how it's been impacted, and I know Jimish you're probably going to talk about this further as well. But looking at it from an immigration lens, because borders have been closed to short-term travel, so visitors not being able to travel for business purposes as they normally would have, often we've had to look at immigration options for the individual instead. So, for example, where a site visit may have been permissible as a business activity, because that option is not there at this present time, we've had to look at getting a work permit for the individual instead. And that's often had an impact on costs, also on any foreign quotas that a company may have, as well as duty of care from an employer-employee perspective. So it's definitely impacted. So we can move on to the next slide and have a look at the high-risk travel lanes. I touched on the Indian subcontinent just then, and Jimish, I know you're going to talk about this in more detail as well. But definitely travellers from this region have been subject to the most stringent travel restrictions, and have often not been able to travel as expected. So, say, for example, if they may have had job offers that have had to be reconsidered, or looking at travel at a later point. Travellers have often had to be creative and look at third country options, travelling to a third country location before they're able to travel. And obviously with this comes huge amounts of risk. It's not something that companies and employers have often advocated as an approach, but I know that this is starting to change a little with the travel restrictions easing, and obviously now we've been in the pandemic for the period of time that we have. So travellers have had to go to another location, spend a period of time there before they're able to make their onward journey. But things can quickly change, so this is never a guaranteed option. We always have to look at whether the individual could become stranded in that third country location, whether they would have work rights. So this is again something that needs to be carefully managed, and communication around this is really key for employers to have with their employees if they are looking at this option. And then just focusing a little bit more on Singapore, as we have had a number of changes in the last couple of weeks with the ease of travel, with the recategorization of some countries, and also the enhancement of the VTLs. And I think this is definitely driving demand for travel now. At the moment, Singapore seems to be slightly ahead of the rest of the region, but that's not to say that the rest of the region isn't going to catch up and also look at similar programs if the programs in Singapore do end up working out well. But obviously we have just had the extension of the stabilization phase as well, so that is continuing onshore. So definitely a point to bear in mind as well. COVID cases are still on the rise. And again, I think it's going to be a period of observation for us over the next few weeks and months in terms of how it all pans out with travel in this region. But definitely some positive steps. But I would say from an employer perspective, if you do have significant numbers of your population, your worker population traveling right now, it does really need to be carefully managed from a communication standpoint, from a duty of care standpoint. Just as, like I said, we've been in this for 2 years now. Anything can change. There are no guarantees. Anything can change tomorrow. And with that, I could keep talking about immigration, but I'm going to pause there and hand back to you, Jod.
Thanks, Anne. I think lots of practical points there for our audience to bear in mind. We have had a question, and linking back to the point that you made, Sam, just around travel to the Indian subcontinent. So Jimish, let me bring you in quickly for this one, being based in India. So one of our audience members has asked, many of the organizations still have people stranded in India, and that's set to increase over the holiday period. What's the latest news in India regarding the tax positions potentially for these individuals, and whether there's any possibility of any further COVID exemptions being announced?
Thank you, George, for this one. As you rightly said, yes, definitely there is a huge population of stranded employees in India. San did cover in some bit of about employees getting offers and not able to move out, especially after the severe second wave where there were restrictions. And there is definitely some remote work which is being managed through India. What was expected, as happened last year, was some relaxation on the tax counting days in terms of the physical presence, because that's the primary test to define any person's residency in India. Last year, which is basically 1920, there was a specific exemption circular issued by government which talked about excluding certain days while computing the residency. Similar circular was expected in 2021. However, the discussion drilled down more towards the treaty reliefs because India being a country which has treaties with almost all countries, the thought process was that the treaty definitely covers the situation, and if there are any possible exemptions, deductions which can be availed because of double taxation, treaty would definitely help you come out of it. If it's not possible for you to take any treaty relief and there is double taxation, a specific form was prescribed which had to be filed last year, and case-to-case analysis would be done by tax authorities to see if there is double taxation and give you some relief. But with due dates around the corner, which is kind of extended due date 31st December 21 for filings which are due now, doesn't seem to be any specific reliefs other than the circular which kind of provides an indicative answers talking about the treaty reliefs which could be possible in various scenarios where people are stranded.
Thanks, Jimish. So I think the message there is hopefully the treaties can help you. If not, there's probably a very real chance of double taxation in these scenarios. I hope that answers your question. So that takes us to the second polling question of the day. And this question relates to remote work. So the question is, what is your corporate policy to deal with employees that may be stranded overseas due to personal travel undertaken over this holiday period? Your options are: remote work is not allowed. There is no formal remote work policy at this stage. We are currently experimenting or conducting a pilot. They will be able to work remotely from a location where they have the right to work. And then finally, they will be able to work remotely from anywhere for a set period of time. So whilst we're waiting for the results to come in, I just want to share that in the next few minutes, we'll be providing just a high-level overview of some of the issues created and the implications of remote working, and that is likely to result due to the extended travel over this holiday period. Particularly will be relevant if we start to see border controls tighten again over this period as a result of some of the issues that Sandeep spoke about earlier. Now, for a detailed overview, though, of this topic, please do listen again to our previous debrief session that focused on remote working in more detail. The link is available in the download and links section. So hopefully we now have the results of this survey. And it's really interesting that we've got a broad spread and two distinct groups, I guess, emerging, but also maybe a higher than expected results in able to work remotely from a location where they have the right to work, and exactly the same percentage in terms of anywhere for a set period of time. And this aligns with the pattern that's emerging from our discussions with many organizations in the region and globally on this topic. And that is that there's a group of organizations that are trying to limit or control remote working very closely. So that would be our first two categories there in terms of remote work, or there is no formal remote work policy at this stage. We then see a group around who are piloting. That seems to be less relevant from our audience today. And then we have another group which is, charging ahead in terms of enabling remote work or always saying yes. And what we're finding is that's primarily due to the employee experience pressures, and particularly in hyper-competitive talent sectors such as the technology sector. If we can move through to the next slide. Now, the implications of any extended remote working periods will be significant. The employee-led demand for remote working is self-evident, but the issue is that it means that employers are less likely to know geographically where their employees are. And this will create a broad, complex range of compliance obligations that will impact a range of stakeholders that don't necessarily typically always work closely together on a BAU basis in most organizations. Also, what we're finding is that the answer to this is really simple technology-driven solutions that are required to automate the assessment of risk due to the volume of requests for these types of working arrangements, which means that once that assessment of risk is completed or triaged, that the SME time across all of these various stakeholders can then focus on the higher risk cases that really matter to your organizations. So at the bottom of the slide, we've set out a number of the exposures that these arrangements can create. And it's really interesting that in my personal discussions with organizations in the region, most organizations are very aware of the potential tax and immigration aspects, but don't always consider the wider variety of risks that could be created, such as the permanent establishment risk, the intellectual property issues, employment law issues, regulatory issues, particularly in the financial services sector, and local payroll requirements are also often overlooked. If we can move to the next slide. And this predominantly occurs when organizations try to employ the outdated day count approach to assessing risk. And I say outdated because unfortunately it's just not straightforward anymore. And that's because many of the issues that are highlighted on the previous slide are triggered by different factors. So, for example, when we look at immigration, the right to work requirement is typically driven by the nationality of the individual, not a day count test. When we look at income tax and social security, as Jimish was talking about in the India example, much will depend on whether there is an income tax or social security treaty between the relevant countries. When we look at payroll, that is typically dependent on the income tax or the social security position, but is very often overlooked. When we look at corporate tax and regulatory aspects, it's dependent on numerous factors, including the specifics of the role, of the responsibilities of the individual, the job title, etc. And then employment law increasingly is becoming a problem for organizations as well, because depending on the country, some locations have a much lower tolerance to the creation of employment law rights, which could add significant cost burdens dependent upon your travel lanes and the nexus that you have for people within your organizations. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this was just a very quick touch upon this topic. We could have dedicated the whole session to this, but I would urge you, if you didn't watch the debrief previously, please do refer to the link that has been provided for more information on this topic. So this brings us to the third polling question of the day, which relates to business travel as we move to this topic. So the question here is, what is your key concern for undertaking business travel? when this resumes in 2022? And please, can you answer this question as a prospective business traveler yourself? So your options are understanding COVID-19 travel and quarantine restrictions prior to travel, quarantine requirements on arrival in your destination or upon your return home, concern about contracting COVID-19 whilst traveling, clarity of travel policy and medical insurance coverage, and then others. So whilst we're waiting for those results to come in, Carl, can I ask you to come back in here and just give us with a more detailed overview in terms of the outlook for corporate travel in 2022 and some of the challenges that organizations have faced in terms of updating or maybe transforming their approach in response to some of the challenges we've seen over the last 2 years?
Hi, John. I think for the first one with regards to corporate travel, I think I touched on it earlier. The expectation is that corporate travel will lag behind leisure travel. And there's probably several reasons for this. One is leisure travel is up to the individual's right to decide about whether they go, whereas corporate travel obviously is defined by the organization itself. So making sure that that organization feels confident it's not putting its employees into harm's way, and that their employees are protected, will naturally lead to a reticence to move forward with travel. Plus, we do have the opportunity with current technology and current platforms such as this, or Teams and Zoom, that we can look at alternatives to travel. And we've been forced into that in the pandemic, but we widely expect that those platforms will continue as we go forward. So I think from a corporate travel perspective, there's still going to be this lag throughout 2022 here in the Asia Pacific region versus what we've seen in the past. In terms of what organizations can do, I think first and foremost, it's really, really important for them to have a think back to what they define as permissible travel. So in the past, it's been relatively clear, or it's been up to individuals and their line managers to decide whether or not somebody can travel. But I think at an organizational level, looking back to really define where travel would be permitted, is permitted. And secondly, what are the alternatives to travel, and enforcing those is really critical. When we think about permissible travel as well, that all comes from the travel policy. So using this time prior to going back to normality and revisiting your travel policy, looking for areas that you need to elaborate or be clearer on is absolutely critical. And certainly the clients that I talk to and the travel managers or procurement heads, really trying to help them define what their travel policy are. And that can be on trip. So for instance, if you're going away on a business trip, previously hotel selection was generally left to employees. There was a selection of hotels generally for preferred properties, but really nowadays you want employees to choose properties based potentially on hygiene standards. And that may mean a slightly higher cost, but you want your employees to be protected. So really going back and looking at which properties or suppliers you select, why you select those suppliers. Sandeep touched on this earlier in terms of some of the complexities of international immigration. If you're flying through a destination like the Middle East, which was very, very common pre-pandemic to go between Asia and Europe, that may mean that your ability to enter a country on destination is impacted because the UAE or Qatar or wherever is not seen as an open country from a immigration point of view, and that may negate the ability to work through. So some of these rules are quite complex, and making sure that you as an organization are crystal clear so that your employees are crystal clear. The final thing I think from a preparation point of view is consider the what ifs. What if your employee gets sick overseas? Hopefully they're mild, but what would you do there? They can't fly back. They've tested positive for COVID. They may have a temperature. They may not be severely ill, but what's the scenario there? How do you include that in the travel policy? Or how do you make sure you're prepared to deal with that eventuality? If the employee is unfortunately very sick and needs hospitalization, where do we stand? Are we covered with travel insurance? Do they pay directly? Will it be a central bill? And I'd always urge organizations to look at top destinations they used to travel pre-pandemic and making sure those destinations were the first they approached to try and understand. Particularly in locations where English may not be a first language, if the predominant travelers you have are English speakers, and making sure that there's no language barriers there, both from a primary care or a secondary care perspective. So I think some of those perspectives really need to be considered when you look at this from a corporate travel perspective. I think finally, ideally, you want to automate this process. You want to easily be able to see where your employees are at a snapshot. So you want that approval process before they travel to be tightened and clarified. But when employees are on the road, how do you make sure you can see where they are? If there is an incident, say in Tokyo, if there is an incident in Europe, if borders change or look like changing in a certain European country, you want as an organization to know which of your employees are there and be able to communicate with them directly. So again, there are platforms now which are very advanced to allow organizations to do that, but they do require some planning. They do require generally a technology platform to be in there. They do require single travel management companies to be in place. Well, you can do it with multiple, but it's a nightmare, let me assure you. So making sure that you've rationalized as much as you can in terms of your travel processes, and that you've contracted with organizations like Deloitte, for instance, who are immigration experts who can then provide assistance, or a travel management company who can provide assistance should things go more difficult for those employees. I think those are the really key critical elements, all of course linked to duty of care, which again Sandeep touched on a little bit earlier.
So some really practical points there.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what the poll is, though. I'm curious to see what people have said.
Let's bring those results up. Okay, so I think, as you said, Carl, I mean, it chimes with some of the key points that you mentioned there in terms of pre-travel, understanding exactly what those requirements are. You know, as you spoke about earlier, the SHN, the quarantine requirements are a big deterring factor. And then you touched upon this actually in your, whilst you were just speaking around concern around contracting COVID-19 and clarity of travel policy and medical insurance coverage. What are you seeing organizations do in terms of that type of insurance coverage? The insurance that was in place before, is that still suitable at this time for people that are traveling?
Look, generally, organizations relied on their corporate payment platforms, so their corporate cards or central billing accounts, which would provide rudimentary travel accident insurance, lost luggage, delayed flights, and so on. It's interesting that a lot of organizations really have not considered the impact of hospitalizations overseas. This is pre-COVID. So really making sure that they do have those processes in place. And it is quite ad hoc. So some organizations will say, look, this doesn't happen very often. And when it does, we will directly reimburse employees or pay hospitals directly. There was an incident a year just before COVID, actually, where I knew of somebody in an organization who was in the United States and had a major heart attack, for instance. And the organization there did not necessarily have travel insurance, but they paid the bill of that individual because he was on a bona fide business trip. So that tends to have been it, more of a reactive way. I think going forward, though, employees do want to know where they stand and how that will be handled. And as an employer, it's really important that you've considered that from a duty of care perspective, so that you're crystal clear. Okay, this is our position. Should this eventuality, unfortunately arise, we're not having to think. We're not going to be behind the eight ball and trying to develop a policy at that place. Use this time now, while things are quiet and people aren't traveling here, to put these processes or situations in place. I recently came back from Germany on the vaccinated travel lane, and obviously to do that, it was a personal trip, so I had to buy travel insurance directly. It's not necessarily as cheap as it used to be, but it gives you peace of mind that should anything happen, you're financially covered. And I think that's where organizations at least need to have a position.
Well, wise words, I think, Carl. Be prepared, as they say, and use this current downturn time wisely. Just a reminder for our audience, we will have some time allocated for Q&A at the end of this session. So please do continue to put in your questions in the box on your screen there at the bottom, and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can in today's session, or we will follow up to all of the questions in the next couple of weeks. So at that point, if we can move on to the next session, the next slide here. Jimish, maybe if I can bring you in here in terms of, with your specialism in helping organizations deal with the issues created by business travel, what are your thoughts on some of the issues that Carl's just mentioned, and how are organizations reviewing their approach to some of the issues that Carl spoke about?
Thank you, George. I think some of the points, if I take very relevant points which Carl made about business travel having a lag but slowly picking up, and definitely this is the right time to revisit on policies, etc. And why would you do that? And if I talk about the policies at first point in time, it's about policy when a traveler has to travel. So what's permissible, not permissible? Do you need any approval process in there? It's about policy when the traveler is present at the destination country. What happens then? How do you take care of that stuff? It's about policy on when the traveler actually returns home, and post that, is it triggering any compliance requirements? Is there any tax filing requirement? Will he be tax equalized, not tax equalized? Lot of considerations when we talk about the business travel landscape. The complexity has definitely further increased when we talk about the new environment and the travel restrictions and the new travel requirements when you make a travel. What we see on slide currently is definitely an evolving landscape of business travel. It definitely starts with you make a booking. Definitely there is a cost involved for the organization in terms of the travel cost and if any compliance cost, and with enhanced cost in terms of any quarantine requirements or insurance cost. If we go ahead, definitely there is traveler safety as one of the considerations, and the duty of care as an employer. But if I look at an overall ambit of duty of care as of now, it's more covering the additional areas as well. It covers the COVID-19 travel restrictions, and as we saw in the poll questions also, those were almost 50% of the audience had a concern on that part. If I talk about right to work, it's again on immigration requirements, which we all know, but they have got slightly complex. It's not only about the visa, it's also about the permissibility, the country rules at that point in time when you make the travel. Again, right to work doesn't stop at immigration, especially posted worker directive, which is more of a EU requirement. So if any travels made to EU, are you compliant on your posted worker directive obligations, which basically means a filing or a notification has to be done pre-travel. If I go ahead and if I talk about compliance, it's compliance not only for the employee, it's compliance for the employer as well. So if there are any payroll requirements for the employer, if there are any withholding requirements, as an employer, are you creating any corporate tax exposure with a lot of travelers present from the same entity into same destination? As an employee, have you crossed certain thresholds which were there under the treaty because of forced stay, because of stranded, or you came on a particular visa, but you're not allowed to fly back? Is there a conversion possible in the same country? So there are a lot of considerations now when we talk about business travel landscape, and Carl made a point was quite relevant is how do you understand with a click of a button where your traveler is and what you need to do in case if any of the countries suddenly come up with some new restrictions. At the bottom of the page, definitely then we talk about thinking something on end-to-end in terms of a business travel program. It starts with the booking in terms of permissibility, not permissibility, and it ends on the compliance requirements for the employer and the employee. Definitely data is a critical factor when we talk about an automated compliance. So that's a thought to be revisited, where you hold the data, how you hold the data, and how we can use that. You need to have a scalable approach. Today you may not have travelers to EU, but if tomorrow you have, what do you do about posted worker directive requirements? Today you may not have travelers to US, and you may not be worried about state-to-state compliance, but what if tomorrow you have? Then definitely with doing all this, there has to be a positive employee experience, because there is already a burden in terms of the way the bookings and the complexities are. So when you add an additional layer of compliance, which is an important factor to be added in, how do you do it in the best way that you have a great balance between the compliance and the employee user experience? And definitely at the end, it's all about the entire oversight and governance. Once you have the process in place, how you kind of put the right tracking mechanisms and the right workflows to ensure that the process is working seamlessly. With that thought, if I move to the next slide, and if I briefly talk about some of the considerations for organizations in terms of the business travel program, it's kind of divided into three buckets. It talks about imagine, it talks about deliver, and it talks about run and revisit. Imagine is more to cover on the policies and processes, which we just discussed on the earlier slide. Are your policies right? Does it culturally fit? If you're making any changes, what are your key risk areas? Is it PWD? Is it tax? What are your key traffic lanes where you see more risk and you want to do a deep dive on that? In terms of the employee journey and user experience and the change management related to any change in policies and processes, where if you need an employee to do an additional step, so he is compliant, the organization is compliant, definitely that would need some kind of communication and change management within the organization. So those are some of the critical factors which is the right time to deliberate upon while business travel picks up again. And then when we have this in place, to talk about how you get the right data to do that analysis. So is the data consolidated at one place, or it is scattered for different TMCs and you have to kind of gather it, or you have a model in place where you talk about the user experience or compliance ratio in kind of having that balance between the two. So that's what when we come to the deliver phase, you get the right data in, you do the analytics, you kind of have at a click of a button things available for you, for your employees, and kind of track it and see it if there are any issues in there. And what you need to do as the last step is, once you know what you need to do on the imagine phase, once you know where your data sits, definitely that gives a nice segue to talk about, are your policies right? Do you need to change anything on your processes? Do you need to revisit any of the data landscape and see if there is a better source or a consolidated source available to do the analytics, and ensure that there is a compliance evaluation and compliance being managed for the business travelers, which sometimes sit in silos in different business functions and may be missed, unlike a mobility program, which is an end-to-end program. So it's kind of a right time evaluation for looking into the business travel program and their key considerations. If we go to the next slide, it basically is an example of how you take a data in an integrated manner. And it kind of relates back to an alliance which we have with SAP Concur. So it basically is a journey where with an integration, how seamless a journey could be for an employee or a traveler who is booking his travel, and how seamless it could be for an employer as well, who is basically going to monitor the compliance via dashboards and see if there is any action where the travelers are. Is there anything which he need to do as an employer, and is the employee aware about his responsibilities before making this travel? So if I start from the top, we have an employee, Joanne, who wants to travel to Madrid and wants to do the booking. So Joanne goes into the system, does the travel booking, and puts his itinerary details. When Joanne selects her dates and she kind of moves ahead, provides her purpose of travel, provides nationality, and kind of goes and books the flight. What happens is on the back end, the data is available in an integrated model and it gets pushed to the vendor systems. The vendors can basically perform an analysis and email it back to Joanne that your trip to Madrid is fine enough from an immigration perspective, but you may have this COVID-19 restrictions. You may need a PWD filing, or you may not need a PWD filing based on the information Joanne submits. It's kind of a seamless approach for Joanne. She gets to see the details. She gets to see the risks and requirements for her travel. Clarence, who is an employee of the organization who is responsible for monitoring business travel, can go into the dashboards real time and see what are the requirements for Joanne. Is there any service to be initiated internally or externally to any of the vendors via the workflows, initiate the service and ensure Joanne is all ready and happy to travel. Definitely when we talk about this integrated model, the user experience is extremely high. It's completely integrated into the booking process, which makes it very seamless. there is real-time data collection and real-time assessment. The data collection is definitely simplified as the traveler is booking the travel, which anyways he has to do. Along with the same process, you get an assessment. The engagement levels for the employees are high. And as dashboards are available for employers, there is a complete ease in tracking. So as we see this journey, this is kind of a key consideration. Does it culturally fit? Revisit your policies and processes and think about how the new world of travel would look like. And are you ready for that? Back to you, Jord.
Thanks, Jimish. And I think it's, it's a great example of how the technology and the integration with other internal systems can provide a great solution, particularly when we look at the responses to the question in terms of, the vast majority of the audience today were worried exactly about having sight of these types of COVID-19 considerations prior to undertaking travel. So thank you, Carl, Sandeep, and Jimish. That brings us to the end of today's discussion. We now have some time to respond to some of the questions from the audience. So first of all, San, if I can bring you in just on, we've received a question here around, do we foresee travellers from the Indian subcontinent being permitted entry to countries in the Asia-Pacific region in the near future?
I think it's a great question. I think it's one that we're all watching very closely. We have had some information in the last few days around Australia opening up to travellers coming from India if they are family members of residents and citizens. So that's definitely a positive move. In terms of the other countries in the region, we're probably not going to be seeing anything similar just in the near future. But I would definitely say Q1 of next year. I think there's definitely been some developments on the Indian subcontinent front with numbers of cases decreasing quite rapidly. And what we've seen in the past is how governments have reacted to these. They monitor, they see the levels of transmission going into other countries. So definitely Q1 of next year, we should hopefully see some movement on that.
Great, thank you, San. Some hope there for a lot of our colleagues and colleagues of audience attendees that are currently in India or will be travelling to India over this period. We've got time for one more question. So Carl, you mentioned rationalization of TMCs. So we have a question here just around what benefits those organizations are seeing, clearly from an organization that maybe has multiple TMCs.
Yeah, generally across Asia Pacific, companies will either have, when we say multiple TMCs, they may have a different TMC per country for local reasons, historic reasons generally, or they may have multiple in the same country. I would personally strongly urge you to go locally with one in the same country. There's different reasons why that's been the case, and I think that there's really probably two groups. The first is driven by the sort of the Indian cultural mentality of, I don't want to put my eggs in one supplier basket. I want to have a little bit of competition. I'll give a bit of business here, a bit of business here. That way it'll keep them on their toes. So that sort of mentality of supplier management has dictated multiple TMC sources. Plus, there's a belief, which is probably wrong, frankly, that you can get cheaper rates by doing that and playing people off against each other. That's fine, and you could work with that. But bear in mind, if you've got an organization with many employees traveling in one go across multiple global destinations, it's incredibly hard to, one, find out where they are, two, get the data to prove that, and to put policies in place, and number three, communicate to those employees when they're traveling. Jimish mentioned that having basically one single source of data to be able to identify where your employees are and one platform to go out to communicate to them is really critical. And if you've got one TMC, it's so much easier. So I would personally strongly urge people to think more around duty of care and about what you're trying to do for the business rather than necessarily nickel and dime and say, well, I can get this TMC for $40 a transaction and this one for $39. I'm going to push the $39. I think see it more broadly than that. Look at how TMCs can save you money on rates and particularly the larger TMCs can do an incredible job around that. So if you are worried about total cost of ticket, I would urge you to do that. I do stress, by the way, I don't work for a TMC, so this is not a commercial. But if I was a procurement head now, I would want my processes to be as simple as possible. I would want to leverage the best technology that's possible, and frankly, that's only really possible if you've got a very clean TMC base. So don't see them necessarily as a cost burden. See them as an opportunity to help you with duty of care.
Thank you for that insight, Carl. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. I hope that you found today's session informative and insightful. A huge thank you to Carl, to Sandip, and to Jimish for sharing their experience with us. And special thanks to all of you who were able to join us. We would like to encourage you to fill out the short survey that will pop up on your screen shortly and tell us what you think about today's program. If you joined us late, please note that this presentation will be archived for future viewing. If you feel that other colleagues or friends would benefit from this webcast, please share the webcast via the share this icon or have them visit the Dbriefs website and register. We will respond to all the questions that we didn't get to today over the duration of the next couple of weeks. Also, if you think of any other questions or comments later, please do feel free to reach out to me or to our speakers. We'd be more than happy to talk to you. And please don't forget to tune in to our next scheduled webcast from the Geography Update series on 28th of October, which is entitled Digital Transformation and Sustainability, Tax and Japan's Pursuit of Resilience. So from all of us at Deloitte and from Carl as well, we thank you for your participation in today's Asia Pacific Tax webcast. And for those of you that are traveling over the holiday period, we wish you very safe travels. Goodbye.